After that, the script is then going to create a form. This is a reminder. Inside of the API literature, documentation, and language, we refer to forms as pages. So if you see the word page, know that we're referring to a form. You'll also hear the word table used sometimes. Those three terms can be used interchangeably. Just like the option list, we have to create the form first, which is what's happening on this top line here. This third value inside of my function is what's called the body of your request. If you remember from the previous workshop, whenever you have an API request, there are three components to it. The first one is going to be the method, which would be the type of action you're doing. The four options for iFormBuilder's API are get, post, put, and delete, which would be to retrieve records, to create records, for example, to update and to delete. So that's your method. The second component is going to be the resource. And so we use a URL structure to specify the resource that we're interacting with. Now keep in mind with the iFormBuilder architecture, your resources have a hierarchy, a tree structure to them. At the top level, you have the server name. Something like Zerion test.iFormBuilder.com is what I'm using right now. You all should have your own dedicated database. Then within your server, you will have a profile. So you have a profile ID. And then you would have the pages resource. And so that's what we're doing here. We're interacting with the pages resource. We have to specify the profile ID. And the final component to your API request is what is called the body. Now, the body is not going to be present in every single API request. It is only present when you need to supply additional information for that action to be executed, for that API call to function properly. When we're creating a page, we need to know information about that form that we're about to create, specifically the label and the name. So you'll notice here I have my label in a more easy to read setup, capital letters and a space. My name has to be database friendly, and so all lowercase letters and an underscore. To refer back to the iFormBuilder API documentation, if we go to the page resource, when creating a new page, these are all the different attributes that could be included in my body. But you'll notice that name and label are required. So those two have to be in the body of my request, otherwise it will fail. These other attributes down below can be added, but they are optional. Now, after we create the page, again, the response from my API call. So I send a request, the API is going to return with a response. That response is going to be the ID of the page that was just created, which we then use to create elements. So we're now adding elements to our form. We created a form with 5 elements. We have 1 text element, and we have 4 select elements, data type of 7. And again, to find the numeric representations of each data type, you can go to the Customer Success Center, and we have a very easily accessible article there. Some other highlights to the form that we made. The job number has a reference ID set to personal data. This is a flag that we have that you can enable for certain elements that will allow them to be marked as being personal identifiable information. This was added as a feature to the platform, specifically in response to the additional security measures needed for GDPR compliance. And you'll see that right here. And so if I was in the form builder, I would be able to check this box here. What we did inside of our API script by setting the reference ID 5 equal to personal data is what actually happens on the back end. So we're circumventing the GUI, and we're doing this manually with our API call. Also, you'll notice that for these elements down below, there is an attribute called option list ID. This is not required for the text element, but for the option-based elements, select, pick list, multi-select, it would be a required attribute, and we're using the ID of the option list that we created up above. So after we make our option list and add options to it, after we make our form and add elements to it, The last thing that this setup script did was populated the table with some sample data. We created 50 sample records. Each one of them is going to have a random choice for pass-fail with each of these 4 elements. And then the job number is going to be a random string of 5 uppercase characters that gets stored here. After we return that, what we're going to have to do is we have to shape this so that we use this syntax here, body, and then fields inside with an array. And that's going to show right here when I create a new record. Inside of the documentation, you'll see that I have this fields array. A question was asked during the workshop yesterday, how do we do this for subform records, which was a great question. When you do subform records inserting with the API, you have to make sure that you set parent element, page, and record ID. This is outside of that fields key inside of the body. And these 3 values are what are used to triangulate the relationship between parent and child record. And so make sure you add those in. One other thing I wanted to add to the discussion from yesterday is that if you go to the documentation for updating a record, you'll notice that the parent fields are not listed in the attributes list. That is intentional. That is not an oversight. The reason is that you can only set those values upon record creation. You cannot update a record to change those metadata fields. The implication is that once a record is created, you can't update it to make it a subform record of a parent record. You have to create that relationship when the record is made, so initially. After that script ran, this is what your table should look like. Let's go here. So you'll notice that there are 50 records here. The items 1 through 4 have a random distribution of pass and fail, and then you'll see our job numbers here are our 5 capitalized characters randomized as well. So that should bring everybody up to speed with what we did yesterday. What we're going to start with is this warm-up exercise here of writing a request to retrieve all records that meet a specific criteria. Specifically, what we're going to look for is having all of those 4 items, the select elements, have a value of pass. So what I'm going to do here is jump over to my text editor. I have this set up here where I'm importing the iFormBuilder library. I have my server name, client key, and secret set up. I create my API connection here, and then I have a pair of variables for the profile and page ID because we'll be working with those throughout the workshop. Down below, this green text is green because it is commented out. A comment is a line of code that is ignored by the interpreter or basically by the programming language. And so what that means is you're able to write notes inside of your scripts, or in this scenario, what we're doing is we're going one exercise at a time and then commenting it out. So each time we execute the script, it's not going to run the previous exercise. The first one we did yesterday was updating the label inside of the option list. Then we created a user, and then we assigned that user to the page that we made. We ended yesterday with getting all records where item 1 is a fail and item 2 is a fail. And we're going to pick up now and try to grab all records where all 4 items are a pass. We're going to start by remembering that we set all of our API calls to a variable called result. And what we're going to do is use the readRecords function. You'll notice that there's also a ReadAllRecords function. The question yesterday was asked how you grab records beyond the limit of the iFormBuilder API, which is 1,000. So you can only retrieve up to 1,000 records per call with the iFormBuilder API. That limitation is put there so that we can safeguard against requests taking too long, and we make sure that the API is nice and responsive. This function, though, is unique to the Python library, and what it will do is it will loop through and make as many calls as are necessary to retrieve all data from a table. Even if we're talking about 100,000 records, this function will do it in one go. Because we only have 50 records inside of our table, I'm just going to use the read records function. And you'll notice here in this tooltip that there are two required values, the profile ID and the page ID. And these three values, grammar, offset, and limit, are not required because they have a default value. And that you can tell by this equal sign here. Now we're going to use the variables profile ID and page ID. And for our grammar, you'll notice here, if I grab the grammar, the field grammar from the previous request, I have all the fields I want: job number, item 1, item 2, item 3, and item 4. And then I set criteria for each one of them. I want item 1 equal to the string fail, as well as item 2. So what we're going to be able to do here is we're going to be able to modify this slightly and then execute our command. So I wanted all of them to be equal to pass. So I'm going to set these two first. Notice I'm using the key value for the comparison. I'm not using the label text or the sort order. You have to use the key value because that is what is stored in the database behind the scenes. I'm going to repeat the same convention I have for item 1 and 2 with 3 and 4. So your conditions are going to be enclosed inside of parentheses. You're going to specify the type of comparison. We're looking for equality. And you have to make sure that you have quotes around the value that you're searching for. Now the reason I have this backslash here is because the combination of characters is what's called an escaped character. And that is because the quote is actually a special character inside of the Python language to represent the beginning or the end of a string. You can see it up here, for example. And so if I just type a quote in the middle of this, it would treat that as the end of my string. I don't want that to happen down here below. So I use this backslash first, and then the quotation mark. And then what happens is the interpreter knows to treat that as just a quotation character and not as the special character within the language. We'll do the same thing here. And then after this, we're going to print our result. I'm going to save, and then I'm going to come down here to my command line to execute this file. Make sure you're in the directory that this file exists in. I'm going to type Python 3. If you're on a Windows machine, you should be able to type just Python. But if you're on a something running OS X or Linux, then you'll probably want to type Python 3. So I'm going to do Python 3 and then the name of the file, which is advancedworkshop.py. Press enter. And what we see printed to the screen is this response right here. Now what I want to do is copy this and unpack this for everybody. So let's take a look at this. We're going to set the language to Python, and I'm going to format this real quickly. This may not format nicely, actually. Okay, so we'll leave it like this then for now. What I'm going to do is show you where each of the different records are, though. So you'll see what is being returned is all the records where item 1 is equal to pass, 2, 3, and 4. All four of those elements have the value pass stored in them. It looks like we have a total of 5 records that do so. Keep in mind, if you're following along, you may not have exactly 5 records because these were randomly generated. So I happen to have 5. Your number might be slightly different. If this didn't work correctly for you, you may be running into a few different things. First of all, the easiest way to verify is that you're actually getting everything with a pass. If you have an error in your field grammar, like let's say, for example, I mistype the name here. I type item 5. And I try to run this. If there's errors in your field grammar, then what's going to happen is you're only going to get the IDs. What's happening here is it's ignoring the field grammar because there was an error and returning the request as if there was no grammar included. And that is not a behavior of the Python library. That's a behavior of the iFormBuilder API. And so if you were using another tool like Postman or writing this in a different language, you can expect similar results. Now I'm going to pause here for a second and ask if anybody has any questions about what we just did here. If you were able to follow along, give me a quick okay in the chat. And if we do have questions, I'll be able to answer them at this point. Good stuff, Gabe. All right, things are looking good. Dave, that's good. Rob, good. Just give it a minute if people are following along. I want to give everyone time to be able to complete the exercise. Marco, good question. So the function ReadAllRecord, I can show you what that looks like here. It does have similar parameters, except that it only has profile ID, page ID. There is no and grammar. There is no offset and there is no limit because the intention is to grab everything. So what happens is the function behind the scenes sets the offset to 0, the limit to 1,000, and it loops appropriately, changing the offset. All right, very, very good. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next exercise. One of the things you may have noticed about this function call, this API request, is that I had to specify every single data column that I want returned. So I'm hard coding them into the request. And if you have a form that's really long, this process could take a really long time to type them all out. The other problem is if you have a form where you make changes to it, as soon as you make a change, maybe you delete an element or you add a new element, your request is not complete anymore. You either need to add to it or you need to remove from it, or you may have errors. And so our next exercise here is going to be to get the records in a two-step process. So what we want to do is get all records by first retrieving all elements data column names. Okay, so we have to first get the data column names of all the elements, and then we're going to use that inside of our request. Okay, so let's begin here. Because we're going to be doing a multi-step process, I don't want to use the word result for everything. So what I'm going to do here is use the word elements as my variable name. And this is something that you can change. It's really personal preference. I like to try to name my variables equal to the type of resource I'm interacting with. It helps keep my scripts legible for me. So I'm going to refer to the API connection I have, and I want to read all elements. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? Just like before, I'm not going to use the all. I'm just going to use the regular one. Read elements. And you'll see to read all the elements, it requires a profile ID and a page ID, which makes sense. We need to know what profile we're in, and then we need to know what page we are in. So I have variables for these: profile ID, page ID. And now for our grammar, we may need to add something here. But before we do that, let's run this command and see what we get. Okay, so I'm going to save this and run my command. And down below here, you'll see I have the ID and the name, ID, and the name. So this API request gives us what we need already, which is just the data column names. We don't need any of the other information about the elements. Now that is specifically because we know that there are no subforms in this. If you needed to retrieve a more comprehensive data structure, or your form is more complex, you may need additional parameters to get all of that information together. But for a simple form like this, we just need the data column names to create our field grammar. Now, if we take a look at the response from the API, you'll notice how this is structured. So this is going to be an array which in Python is actually called a list. That is the proper data type. We have a list of objects, or sorry, an array of objects, which in Python is referred to as a list of dictionaries, actually. So I want to make sure I use the proper terminology here. But for the purpose of this workshop, I'm going to call them arrays and objects because it's more familiar with the JSON data structure. So our array is of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objects. Each object has a key of ID and a key equal to name. Now what we need to do is we need to grab the name for each one of these values, and our end result we want to be something like this: job number, item 1, item 2, item 3, and item 4. So what we're going to need to do is we need to take this data structure and we have to do a transformation. We have to manipulate it to get what we want. Now what I'm going to show you is 2 methods to do this. I'm going to show you first the manual way, which is going to be more lines of code, but it's also easier to follow along. And then I'm also going to show you the more condensed way to write this as well. Let's do this. We'll put a little comment here. Method 1 for creating this is we need to loop through our elements array. So I'm going to use a for loop for element in elements. Now what this loop is doing, this is a little bit different than a JavaScript loop where you may have seen the for I equals 0, I less than length, so on and so on. What this loop is going to do is it's going to go through every item inside of elements. So this being one item, this being another item, so on and so on, 5 total. So each object. Each object will be assigned to the variable named element, and then we'll be able to do stuff with it. Okay. Now to keep track of all of these different values, what we're going to do is we're going to create our array of different element names. So element names is equal to an empty array. And for each iteration of this loop, I want to add to that array element names.append element name. Now, what this is doing is it's looking at this object and then grabbing this key's value. We can go ahead at the end of this and print element names to check. And we get job number, item 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've added just the element names to our array. The next thing we're going to do is combine them into a string, and we're going to use the comma to separate them. Okay, so I'm going to say fields equals comma dot join element names. Okay, and then we'll jump down here, print out fields, and see how this looks. And you get this comma separated string of the different elements. I'm going to pause here for a second, let everybody catch up, let you guys digest this for a minute, and then we'll talk through this again in a little bit more detail and answer any questions. Okay. So there's really two techniques being done here. The first technique is taking the return from our API call, which was the array of objects, and converting it to an array of strings. So we're shaving off what we didn't need. We didn't need the element IDs for each of these. We only needed the name value. And so that was how we condensed it down to this using our for loop right here. The append method or function is just going to add whatever you give it inside of these parentheses to the bottom of the array. So we're adding to the newest index. It's a very similar behavior as filling out subforms. Each time you fill out a subform record, it adds it to the bottom of that subform array. Once we have our array of names, then we use this technique in order to create a single string. Now, the way we're going to read this is we're going to take the string, which is just a single comma, and we're going to use this as the delimiter to join our list of strings, element names. If I wanted to put a vertical bar or a pipe here, and I save this and run this again, you'll notice down here you have this vertical bar separating them. If I just leave this empty, all the text is going to be compressed all together in a single line like this, which we don't want. But I just want to show you everyone the different options here. So now that we have our fields, we're able to use this inside of our API request. So I can go back to result equals API.readRecords, profile ID, page ID, and for our grammar, we're going to use the variable fields. Print our result, and this is going to be a big block of text because we're getting all the records and all the keys from them. But importantly, we just need to look right here at this top record. You'll see we have the ID and we have every single data column name here. Okay. Any questions about this so far? Are we comfortable with what we talked through here? If you were able to follow along, again, quick OK in the chat is really helpful. All right, good stuff. Very cool. All right, now, just so everyone knows here, I'm going to do a quick second method for creating this string, because what we can actually do is compress all these things. We can say, let's do here, method 2 for creating this. So what we can say is fields equals. We're going to join. Now inside of here, what I need to do is supply the commands necessary to create this array of strings. So we can do this. We can use an array, and we'll say for element in elements, what we want to store is element name. Okay. So we can do all of this in one line actually. This right here and this right here are going to provide the same result. So what I can do is quickly comment this out, save this, and run. And you'll see here we get the same thing. We get all of our records back in the result. Okay. Now in terms of which method is better, I don't want anybody to get overly concerned about that. Ultimately, both of these execute at almost identical speeds. The only reason I show this is because one of the benefits of working inside of Python is it has a lot of really nice small shortcut techniques that you can use to compress some of your commands. It makes your code a little bit more concise, but granted, it's also more dense. It takes a little bit more time to unpack what you wrote, whereas this may be a little bit more logical, a little bit more easy to read because each step is smaller. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to comment all of this out, and we're going to go through our next exercise. So the next exercise is I want us to update all records that have a value of fail in item number 4. Okay, so let me write the prompt here. Update all records with a value of fail for item number 4. And instead of just walking through and writing the solution immediately, I am going to give everybody 5 minutes to try to do it on their own. and then at 11:40, we're going to go through it together. All right, still got a few minutes before I go and walk through this myself, but if anyone has any questions or is getting hung up on anything, feel free to speak up and ask as well. All right, let's go ahead and go through this, this exercise here. Now, because we're not retrieving records like we've been doing with the previous exercises, we're updating records, we have to use a different function. So what we're going to be using here is the update set of functions. The resource we want to work with are records. And I'm going to open my parentheses here. And you'll notice that there are a few fields that are required. We need the profile ID, the page ID, then the body, and then our grammar, offset, and limit. So we'll start with our profile ID and our page ID. The next thing is the body. So we need to know how we're going to update this record. What are we setting? I'm going to start by creating my object with my fields array. Inside of the fields array, we're going to take the element name of item 4, and we're going to set its value equal to pass. It's the only way we can update it because we have it set to fail already. After our record, the next parameter is the grammar. And so this is where we're going to identify the records that will be updated. Now, just like we did before here, the nice thing about this is our grammar can be more concise. We don't need to list every single element because we're using this as a filter. So we only need to specify elements with criteria attached to them. What that means is our grammar is going to be focused around the element ID or item 4. And if you remember, we're going to use parentheses here. We want to see if it's equal to fail. Okay. Just so that we are comprehensive, the update records function can also accept an offset as well as a limit, just like the get one does, but we won't need it for the purposes of this exercise. Now, after we run this, we're again going to print result. Let's go ahead and save this. Actually, let me go ahead and clear my terminal for a second here so it's a little bit easier to read. And we'll run our script, and I have an error here. Let's see here. So this is a good opportunity to talk through some debugging here, because you will inevitably run into syntax errors. Now, anytime you run into a syntax error, I want to go through the process of debugging this. The first thing is you want to look at what the actual error is. So you'll see it says invalid syntax, and it tells you where. Now, the tricky thing about this is normally when it comes to syntax errors, the actual point of error is not the problem itself. That is just the point in which the interpreter ran into something that it did not expect. So most likely what you need to do is you need to start at this point here. You'll see line 63 and start backtracking. So I have this key value pair, and then I go back here, and most likely the error is the line before. That I would say 90% of the time you'll run into that, where the error is immediately preceding the actual point that it notes the error. Now in this case, the problem I have here is I have my array, but then I specify a string right afterwards. This is not supposed to be an array of strings. It's supposed to be an array of objects. So what I missed was my curly brace. So once I do this, I'm going to save. Now notice when I save here, I don't have the little squiggly mark here. Most likely what that means is I don't have any sort of errors in my syntax. It's a benefit of using a more advanced text editor. And when I try to run this another time, we see this time it went through successfully. Now, the result is going to be a list of IDs right here. Whoops. Right here. And these are the IDs of the records that were affected. So let's say we are writing a larger integration and we're going to make these updates to these records, and then we want to keep track of what was actually updated. You can do that with these IDs. The response from the API request is going to be the IDs of the records that are affected. You'll see 144, 138, 135, and so on. Not all 50, only the ones that had a value of fail for item 4. Now to verify, what we're going to do is we're going to hop back over here to iFormBuilder. You'll notice here 144, oh sorry, here. Okay, so we had 144, 138, and so on were fail. Let's refresh this page. Oops, timed out here. And you'll see everything is a pass now. Let's view 100 records, which would give us all of them because there are 50 in this table. And we see all passes for this column, which is perfect. Okay, I'll give everybody a second to look through this again, ask any questions if you have. If you were able to follow along well and you've completed it, again, quick OK in the chat, and then we'll move forward. We've got 2 more exercises for the workshop. Okay, looking good. Excellent. All right, so the next exercise we have, our second to last exercise, let me comment this all out, is we're going to assign records to a user that have a value of fail for item 1. Okay. So what we're going to do again is we're assigning records to a user that have a value of fail for item 1. And we're going to say maximum 3. So we're going to make this a little bit more complex than I had originally planned, actually. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this immediately with everybody because this is going to take a couple of steps. Now, what I want to do in this exercise is walk through the problem-solving process. So it's not just a matter of writing code. It's not just Python straight away. What we need to do is we need to figure out the steps involved to make this come to life. And that is going to begin with a thought exercise. And then the next step is actually going to the iFormBuilder API documentation. And then finally, we touch Python at the end. So to accomplish this exercise, the first thing we need to do is we need to know what records we're actually assigning. Okay? So the first thing is to figure out which records have a value of fail for item number 1. But moreover, we also need to keep a maximum of 3. So that means our first step is to get the records that have a fail for item 1, max 3. Okay. Once we have those records, we then need to assign them to a user. So the two questions that come up are, first of all, which user? The second question is going to be, how do we do the assignment itself? Something that we haven't covered yet. So in order to answer that second question, we're going to go straight to the documentation, because I can promise you that even working with the API on a daily basis, these types of resources and requests, none of us here memorize them. So the documentation is always the first place we go. I'm going to look at the record resource, and what I want to do is assign a record. So we'll say create a new record assignment, and we have to study the structure of what we're doing here. Now we'll notice this is a post request because it's a creation of a new assignment. The values we need are the profile ID, page ID, record ID, and then inside of the body, the attributes, we have to specify the user ID to whom we are assigning these records to, or this record to. Okay. So what that means is we need these 3 pieces of information first, and then we're going to assign it to this user. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to say assign each record to the user based on their user ID. So this is something I like to do. I always like to write comments as I prepare my code so I know what pieces of information I need and the identifiers for them as well. So let's start by getting the records that have a fail for item number 1. We're going to call this variable records. Again, I like to name my variables after the resource that I'm interacting with. API.readRecords. Profile ID we know, page ID we know, and now for our grammar, we know that we need item number 1 equal to fail. So I'm going to use this syntax here. Now what I don't need to do is I don't need to get the rest of the record. I don't need item 2, 3, and 4. The reason I don't need it is because if I go back to the documentation, you'll notice that the values I need to make this happen are the profile and page IDs, the record IDs, which always comes with the response, and then the user ID. I don't need to know anything else about the record in order to do this assignment, so I'm not going to include it in my API call. Now, what we do need to do is limit this to a maximum of 3. And so as I do a comma here, you'll notice that I have the word limit that I can set. I'm going to say limit is equal to 3. Now let's save this and run this, so print records, and see what we get. What we would expect is 3 IDs back, maximum of 3. And it looks like we have them here, IDs 150, 147, and 144. Let's real quickly take a look over here to verify. You see a fail, and a fail. So that's perfect. We have these 3 records. Important to note, these API requests begin top down. So most recent record first is what will be retrieved. That's very important to note. You are able to sort with the API. It's inside of the documentation what the field grammar looks like. But I just want to make sure everybody is aware that you are able to do that. So after we have the records, we now need to take each of these records and assign it to the user. Anytime you have to go through a repetitive process, your mind should go straight to thinking about a loop. So we're going to loop through for record in records. We're going to loop through our result of this API call. And we're going to use, let's do this, result equals API dot create record assignments. You'll see we need the profile ID, just like before, page ID, which we got from the documentation, and the record ID. Now for record ID, we're going to use this temporary variable, record, and remember it has a key right here of ID. So I'm going to use a square bracket with the quotation marks to create a string. Now I could use double quotes here, there's nothing wrong with that. For whatever reason, I've gotten in the habit of using single quotes inside of square brackets, but they are interchangeable. And after I have the record ID, now I need the body, right? So who am I assigning this to? Again, going back to the documentation, my body is going to have an attribute called user ID with the value. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create my object, user ID, and now I need to figure out which user I want to assign this to. So what that means is I'm going back over here to the iFormBuilder control panel, and we did this yesterday as well. Let's see who this form is assigned to. Workshop Inspections 3. Okay, we'll see it's assigned to myself, and then I created a user called Workshop User. Now this is the one I want to assign it to. And so what I'm going to do is go over to the Users tab, and the quick trick here is to edit the user, and inside the URL you'll be able to grab their user ID. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Okay. And then also after this, we're going to print each result. So I'm going to save this and run this and see what we get. And we'll see we have 1, 2, 3 records that got printed out as our result. This is, again, the response that you're going to get from this specific resource with the iFormBuilder API. But to verify, let's go back over here to the Data tab. And let's take a look. And you'll see here that those 3 records are assigned to the user workshop user. I want to pause here for a second to explain record assignment if you're not very familiar with it. So that column inside of the data table specifies who that record is assigned to at that moment. As soon as I'm workshop user and I sync my device, if I sync my iPhone and I download those records, this column actually gets cleared out. So that means that the record is not pending assignment anymore. Once the user has the record, they're able to fill it out and resubmit it, and then the record on the server is going to be updated. Now keep in mind, if you assign the record to multiple users, let's say I assign the record to workshop user 1 and workshop user 2. User 1 submits their updates and it gets reflected on the server, but then user 2 submits their updates, it will actually overwrite what user 1 had. So you want to be careful with record assignments. Try your best to assign them only to a single user at a time. And if you do switch that assignment, make sure you let that original person know so that they can't upload their record and then have it potentially be overwritten. All right, any questions about this exercise? Were we able to follow along? If so, as we've been doing over the last 2 days, quick OK in the chat, and we'll move on to our final exercise. All right, looking good. Okay, so our final exercise here is going to be a fun one. This is one I'm very excited about. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be deleting all data for elements marked as personal data. Now, the reason I'm excited about doing this one is because so far, every exercise we've done has been something that can be done on the control panel. So it's not actually necessary to do it using the API. This right here, there is not a button that you can click to do this action. So what we're doing here is we're going to be using the API to intelligently perform this action, and which is something that you can't do on the GUI currently. Now, in order to do this, we have to follow a very similar process as we did up above here. We need to figure out what we're going to be actually deleting. So we need to find that out first. And then we need to go through and do a delete request. Now, I've written this out already. And so I want to take this and place it down here to show you what we have. Okay, and actually I need to add one more line here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to retrieve the elements that are marked as personal data. Those are the ones that we want to delete after all. So I'm going to use the readElements function. You'll see it requires a profile ID, page ID, and then our grammar. Now, if we go all the way back to the beginning of this workshop with the setup script, you'll remember that for our job number, we set this reference ID 5 equal to personal data. And so we're going to use this inside of our field grammar, just like we've done for most of these exercises during this workshop. Okay? So we want to get all the elements from this form where reference ID 5 is equal to personal data. Okay? And what I'm going to do here real quickly is I'm going to print elements, and I'm going to comment the rest of this out because I want to run just this first. So let's save this and run this. What we would expect to see is only that job number field, which it looks good. We have our ID, name is set to job number, reference ID 5 is returned as well because it's part of our field grammar list. So now that we know which fields we have that we want to delete, the next thing we need to do is actually go through the creation process of setting up that delete itself. Now the first line of code here you'll see is checking to see if the length of elements is greater than 0. The reason I'm doing this is because I don't want to do any sort of an update if there is nothing to update. So the first thing I'm going to do is get all the elements that have personal data marked. If it's 0, then I'm done. You'll see here there's an else statement that's going to print out no personal data elements. In the scenario where we do get elements that are returned, I'm going to create my body, which is an object with this fields array. Now I'm going to pause here for a second because I want to keep in mind with everyone that even though we're deleting data, we're not going to be using a delete method for our API request. And that's because you don't have, or we don't have the ability to delete a single field inside of a form. The resource we're working with is a record. And so if we were to use a delete method, we would delete the entire record. And that's not what we want to do. We only want to clear out these personal data fields. So because of that, we will be using an update request. And what we're going to do is we're going to update the value to be empty, effectively removing the data that used to be there. So I'm going to set up my body to begin with, and I'm going to loop through my elements. For every element that's in here, I'm going to add to my fields array this object. Okay? Element name is equal to element name, which would be this value. And the value here is going to be equal to an empty string. Now this is really important because this is, again, a behavior that you need to be aware of working with the iFormBuilder API. You cannot set this value to something like null. In Python, we use the word none because our API does not accept that. So what you need to do is use an empty string, which the API will interpret as being null, and then set the value accordingly that way. So just keep that in mind. Use an empty string here. And then finally, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be updating all records. Now I can substitute in here profile ID, page ID, because I have those variables set. So I'm going to update all the records for this profile, this page, with this body here, right? So my fields are going to be empty. And then the final piece is my grammar. Okay, so you see here, comma. You see the grammar is the next part. The grammar I'm going to be using is I want to update all the records. And so what that really means is I want to update any record that exists in the table. I still have to specify a condition though. If I left this blank, what would happen is no records match my my lack of condition, and so it wouldn't update anything. The way I like to do this is I like to use a field that is known, so everything is going to have an ID, with a condition that I know will catch everything. And because I know the IDs will always be positive numbers, I can just set the ID to be greater than 0, and I know that this will retrieve every single record in my table. We can also go back here and use the same setup as we've been doing the entire workshop. So I'll change the code slightly there. So what should happen here is I should grab all of the elements with a personal data field, create my body, execute the command, and then print the result. In the event that there were no elements with this flag on, then I would just print no personal data elements. I'll go ahead and save this, and I will run my script. Because we're working with the update method for the records resource, it's going to return the ID of all the records that were affected. And you'll see here, starting at 150, going all the way down to 3, I have every single record. I can go back over to the control panel, and I can update, or refresh rather, and see that job number is all cleared out for all of these values. So this little snippet right here can be used for any form that has personal identifiable information. If that's going to be patient names or social security numbers or phone numbers, anything that's going to fall under the need for GDPR compliance, all you have to do is mark those elements as personal data. And then anytime you want to clear out your tables that have those fields, you can just run this quick snippet like we've been doing on the command line, and it's going to take care of that for you. So no more manual deleting or updating or anything like that. Instead of giving me a quick okay that we were able to follow along here, can I get a quick yes or no in the chat to see if this personal data script and flag would be applicable to your own personal context? It's just good for us to know. This is something that's newer to the platform, and so we're still collecting some information on it in terms of how customers are using it. This is great. It's good to hear. Excellent, cool. So one other thing I wanted to bring up with this specific code snippet is going back to earlier, yesterday's workshop, we did go through this process here of creating a user. And one of the things I pointed out was that this API library has some additional utilities included in it. Specifically, we used a function, a built-in function to generate a random password. Now, this personal data snippet is a perfect candidate for adding a utility as well. It's something that we're working on right now. We just are going through questions of do we want to do it form by form, or do we want to go through subforms? There are some configurations that we want to talk through and make sure that we accommodate. And so we haven't published it yet. But getting feedback from people who are using this library and this script is invaluable for us, because that's going to help us know how this would be used in a real world context. So I encourage everybody, as you continue to use this and work with it, if things come up that you wish were in this, absolutely let us know. If there are certain functions that behave a way you would not expect, let us know as well. And it's really helpful for us to be able to catch all the different use cases. All right, well, we're going to wrap up here in a couple minutes. As we've done in all the previous workshops, I do have a pair of polls that I would like to launch. This first poll may look familiar from the beginner workshop, and it's just asking if anybody would like to have a follow-up call to discuss any possible integrations with the API. Now that you have a better feel for what is possible working with this library, if there are things that you want to discuss, both in terms of how to implement as well as the viability and how you may construct what that solution would look like. Happy to sit down and talk through that with you. If it's something that you don't want to do at this time, but maybe in the future, then just reach out whenever you'd want to talk about it. All right, we'll give this a couple more seconds. We almost have everybody voted. All right, thank you all very much. And then this final poll is again the same as the beginner workshop. And I would just like to know kind of where everybody stands after going through these last 2 days. If this is a good spot to settle down in and keep on doing practice working with the library, if you want something that's more advanced, or if after going through this, then you know hands off, the API is not something that is up your alley to work with. All right, everybody has voted. It looks like we have a good distribution here. The majority of participants would like to do a workshop around this level again, and a lot of us would like to do a more advanced continuation. Given those results, I'm going to jump one more poll in here because I have everybody available. And assuming that we did another workshop kind of at the same level, what I'd like to know is what resources you'd like to work with. We worked a lot with records during this workshop. I know previously we did a lot of work with users, but if there are specific resources that you would like to work with more, then go ahead and check them off here. And then that will give me some guidance on how I want to craft the exercises for future workshops. All right, good stuff. Everyone's voted. That was super fast. I appreciate it. It looks like we still want to keep working with existing records, so that's great. Forms as well, new records also. So that is something that we'll keep in mind. You guys can expect an email from me in the coming days for a couple of reasons. The first one is we'll have the recordings posted, so I want to let everybody know that those are accessible on Zerion Academy. The other thing is if you wanted to schedule a follow-up talking about integrations, we'll be able to set that up via email there. And then the third thing is I would like to get some more detailed feedback from each of the participants. And so that's a perfect opportunity for everyone to tell me within these resources what you would like to do with them. And I'm more than happy to tailor the exercises specifically to the people who are participating. With all that being said, it's been a pleasure working with everybody. If there are any final questions, then stick around and I'll be able to answer them. I'm not going to end the workshop until everybody has left. But otherwise, this is all that I have for everybody. I'll be posting the information in the scripts. And again, it's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope you all have gotten something out of this. Thank you again so much.